Hi, I'm Thomas Bowles, Prince William County Agricultural Extension Agent. Welcome to our video.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started here. It's 11 o'clock. Welcome to this Wednesday's class on Hugelkultur and building healthy soil. My name is Thomas Bowles. I'm the Ag Extension Agent here in Prince William County. So ideally, our garden soil, when we break it down, ideally we want it to be half empty space and half solid space. And in that empty space, we want a mix of air and water. We all learned in probably primary school that plants breathe through their leaves, but they also breathe through their roots, and so it's important that there's airspace. This is why when you have waterlogged plants, you tend to have problems with root rots. And so on the solid side, we want a good mix of minerals and about 5% or more organic matter. But we want fine organic matter. I actually ran into a client earlier this month who bought some topsoil that was soil mixed with huge hunks of organic matter, basically mulch, and he's having all kinds of problems. So we don't want big, thick pieces of organic matter. We want small pieces of organic matter. And organic matter is basically dead or decaying bits of plants, bits of microbes, and those sorts of things in the soil that our microbes can cycle through, break down, and put into nutrients that can go into our plants. And so our ideal garden sponge, our garden soil is going to be like a sponge. If we look at under a spectroscope, if we look at a piece of soil and aggregate that's about the size of a BB, in good healthy soil, we've got organic matter, which is represented in green, and open pore space, which is represented in blue. A good mix of that. Those little aggregates are biologically active. As they aggregate together into bigger clods, there are macropores, which allow for drainage of water, that allow for root growth, that allow for bigger creatures to move through. We have gas exchange, which again is good for roots. Most of our beneficials are aerobic creatures, so they thrive where they can get oxygen. And we've got biological glues that are holding these aggregates in place and preventing compaction. Unfortunately, a lot of us are stuck with basically bricks. And if chia pets have taught us anything, you can actually grow things on bricks. It's just not very conducive to plant growth. A lot of our urban soils are very little pore space, very little room for air or water, little to no organic matter. And this creates a really difficult environment for plants to grow in. It's anaerobic, which a lot of our bad microbes are anaerobic microbes, and they thrive in that sort of situation. We don't have a lot of earthworms. We don't have a lot of space for root growth. And a lot of times our water is going to run off of it instead of run into it and infiltrate. And so when we think about how we try and take the brick that we're stuck with and turn it into spongy, good, healthy soil, it's important to remember that biology is the key to healthy soil. If we've got a biologically active soil, it's going to resist compaction. It's going to be alive with organic matter. And generally speaking, the way that we enrich soil is really using carbon to drive that biology in the ecosystem. And so today we're going to talk about hugelkultur, which is one way to develop a really organic garden bed that's got a lot of carbon in it, and it's helpful for the biology. So let's take a look first at some of the things that are really good for improving our soil. One is reducing disturbance, and we're talking about tillage. There are other things that we can do, like mixing plant species and keeping the soil covered and maximizing living roots. But today we're going to talk about establishing beds where we're reducing or eliminating the disturbance that we do for soil. And so when we disturb the soil, we're disrupting soil communities within the ecosystem. Repeated tillage can create hard pans, which makes it difficult for water to infiltrate and roots to go deeper. That said, sometimes you need to destroy the village in order to save it. And what I mean by that is sometimes if you have really, really bad soil, sometimes tillage is necessary to help break it up and allow you to incorporate more organic matter into that soil. But generally, we want to practice no-till methods as much as possible. But again, keep in mind there are some crops that require tillage. If you're growing potatoes, for example, you can't help but till. There's no way around that. But we want to minimize that tillage, minimize that soil disturbance. And so when we're building beds, we have a couple low to no-till options that are very similar, and so we'll talk about both. One is sheet mulching and the other is Hugelkultur. So sheet mulching, you're using, and you can see from the illustration here, you're using alternating layers of browns and greens, and the browns are carbon rich and the greens are nitrogen rich. And this is going to kill any existing vegetation. And because you've got several layers of this that are decomposing together, you're going to get a more nutrient-rich soil. And so here's an example. Several years ago, we were expanding our garden beds, and so we started putting down cardboard. We put some carbon over top of it. Then we started bringing in greens. We marked out our beds. The one thing that we didn't account for is how much green material we would need. We ended up going to Starbucks, and even though it's brown, coffee grounds are considered green because they are very nitrogen rich. So we started making layers, and we used clippings, we used grass clippings, we used clippings from things we were pruning. We did this in late October, and so we were expecting a heavy frost, and so we ripped out some of our plants. This is nasturtium. We used that for layers. And so you're looking at layers of green that are a couple inches. The brown doesn't have to be quite that thick, but it depends on whether it's something like cardboard or it's something heavy or more loose like mulch. But you layer them back and forth. And this is kind of us in progress. And what we ended up with is 3 layers of green, 3 layers of brown, and then compost over top of it with a cover crop in it. And so we did this, like I said, late October. And then by the next summer, we ended up going from this sort of orangey clay here in the center to this rich brown soil here on the left. I'll play this real quick, hopefully. And so that was at the end of the first summer. Oops. And so sheet mulching is very effective. Pros, There's no soil disturbance really. It's a good way to smother crops. Most turf won't hold up to that. And it involves some labor, but it's not really intensive. On the downside, sheet mulching usually takes a season. For example, while we did put cover crops in it, we put them in late, and so they weren't as successful, but we were able to put in crops in the spring. So we had to wait over winter before we could actually use the beds. And again, you need to make sure that you have enough greens and browns to do the space that you want to. Otherwise, you end up with half-done beds until you have all the materials you need. So that's sheet mulching, and there is a type of bed way of starting beds that's similar to sheet mulching, but a little different. It's Hugelkultur or hill culture. And this is a Central European German technique. It can be used with trenching. You can start trenching. You can see in this lower picture, they've dug out a space and then put material in it. You can do it that way, or like this top picture where they haven't disturbed the soil. It's a very effective way of breaking down carbon-rich woody material and basically creating a carbon bank that helps energize the soil. There are lots of ways to do this. Most of them involve using logs. Sometimes they're laid laterally, sometimes they're actually smaller logs like firewood type length that are put vertically. Generally what you're doing is you are putting a base or core of logs, and then you're doing basically sheet mulching over top of it. That you can use all sorts of materials. You can use hardwoods, you can use softwoods, you can use rotted hay bales for your carbon, you can use manures, you can use vegetable matter, you can use grass clippings. One of the nice things about a Hugelkultur bed is that it creates this hill that gives you two different climates. And the advantage to that is that it can extend your spring garden season. So given this diagram, you have the sun coming down on the west or the south, and so this left-hand slope is going to be a lot warmer than the shaded slope on the north or the east. And so you could have your spring vegetables extended on that side, whereas you can, on the other side, on the left side, you can start your summer vegetables. And there are lots of ways to do this. There are lots of different ideas, but again, most of them involve a base of woody plants, layers of greens and browns, and then either compost or a combination of compost and soil. The nice thing about covering it with a layer of soil is usually when you get a layer of soil on top, you can plant into the bed straight away. And depending on when you're making your bed, that can be helpful. Otherwise, you can just put compost over top of it or mulch over top of it and have your layers of greens and browns to slowly decay over the course of the season. And again, you've got your core of hardwoods. Hugelkultur can also be used to terrace. This is kind of an interesting idea where you're making hugelkultur on the terrace. One of the things that's handy with that is that as you get erosion from uphill, what that's going to do is end up filling this area over here on the left, and you'll end up with an actual terrace. So here's an example of hugelkultur that we did at our teaching garden. And this is the end product. Unfortunately, I don't have a whole lot of video pictures of us building it, but we've got a compost topsoil mix over here. I'm putting down cover crops. Our master gardener Gene here is watering everything in. We built this. We did not dig a trench. We decided that that was just too much work. And so we built this Hugelkultur mound, and it was about 3 feet when we started. And it's got this white row cover over it because we had put the cover crop in, and then we were expecting frost, and we just wanted to protect it. We didn't have to do that necessarily. And so this is early in the spring. We've got some of the cover crop coming up. This is cereal rye. Cereal rye was a bad idea because it's not as easy to cut cereal rye on a mound as it is on a flat surface. But this also gives you a good idea of the two climates you have. This is the north side, south side. As the spring went on, we got more rye. We eventually killed that rye and replaced it with initially lettuces. This is later in the spring. We've got lettuce growing on the north side. We had lettuce growing on the south side, but we started to take that out and plant flowers. This is what that mound looked like the first spring. Completely covered with cut flowers, very rich soil, very nutrient dense. This is about 2 years later. And one of the things that we did, ideally in Hugelkultur, you want to have hardwoods, and the more hardwood you have in your core, the longer it's going to last as a hill. And we didn't have hardwoods. We were using fallen pine logs. And so over the years, it's dropped on us, which hasn't been a bad thing because the soil is still rich and it's still a very good place to grow vegetables and other flowers. But this was about 2 years afterwards. You can see there's been some subsidence because of the softwoods underneath that have decayed. This is earlier this year, and I'm sorry, this is the best picture I have of it. But it's about a foot. So in the course of 5 years, it's gone down 2 feet. It's a very fine soil, very friable, very loose. It's excellent. We've got root crops in it now, and they're just thriving. And you know, this is one way that we found that really jump-started the biology because, again, you know, biology is driven by carbon, and we have that carbon core from all the logs and sticks that we put in here. Now, one thing to mention with that is that one of the things about the logs is they become saturated, and so they become a sink for moisture. And so during drought, roots don't have to go very far to get into moisture-rich areas. And so this is a good way to hedge your bets on droughts. The other thing to keep in mind is that you don't necessarily need to use big logs. I've seen Hugelkultur done with sticks. I've seen Hugelkultur done with woody material from plants like rosemary or lavender. So it's really flexible, and there are lots of different ways that you can do this. So when you look at the pros and cons, pros, it's a really good way to use woody material. If you've got fallen timber on your property that you don't want to burn, but you don't have any place to store it, turning it into a bed is a really good way to do it. As I say, it creates a nice nutrient bank. Our Hugelkultur that we've had for 5 years, we haven't had to fertilize it. It gives you more of a surface area to plant because you've got that hill instead of a flat surface, at least for a time. Eventually, all Hugelkultur beds kind of settle down. But again, depending on how much hardwood you have, depends on how long that's going to take. As I said, there are many different adaptations you can do it. with. You can do it with all different types of woody material. It doesn't have to be the really traditional way with lots of heavy hardwood logs and digging a trench and all that. And you have that carbon-rich core that's going to help drive the nutrient cycle. It's going to keep the microbes in the soil very happy. It is a bit labor intensive. Nobody likes to drag logs all over the place and stack them up, but it's not too bad. If you do a trench, it's going to disrupt soil communities, but by the same token, you're adding those layers of greens and browns, and you're adding that carbon, so that's going to help mitigate that. And the big thing is you need to make sure you have everything in place before you start. One nice thing about hugelkultur versus sheet mulching is that you can pile your logs up and wait until you have enough green and brown to cover it, and it's not really going to hurt anything. If anything, those logs are going to help smother the grass or whatever other vegetation is underneath. So really, when we're talking about healthy soil, we want to make sure that we're testing our soil, reducing disturbance, mixing in plant species, keeping the soil covered and maximizing our living roots. And hugelkultur is a really great way to do that because, go back to the diagram, you can have different types of crops growing on the bed throughout the year. You've got nutrient-dense soil. It's very easy to keep this covered. It's very easy to have enough to set this up so it's got lots of carbon to keep the system driving. This is a very good way to get a biologically active bed rather quickly. So with that, I believe, yes, question.
Yeah, we have a few questions in the chat box. The first one is, does it matter whether you use cardboard or newspaper when you're, I think was from the earlier part of your presentation.
Right, so when you're laying stuff down in sheet mulching, I find that cardboard works better. That being said, if you have a thick enough layer of newspaper, it's fine. The big thing you want to avoid is you want to make sure you take the tape off the cardboard and you don't use cardboard or newsprint that's glossy.
Okay, and then the next question is, are there problems with the soil and materials being washed down in heavy rains in the hugelkultur?
That's a good question, and it's tricky. Part of it depends on how much of an arch you give it. So, for example, in this particular drawing, this to me seems like there would be lots of erosion just because it's so steep. In our case, when we built this, we actually, and you can't see it from here, but we actually have a log running here and a log on the other side to help capture anything that eroded down. But we still had a little bit of issue on the end. The big trick is to keep this covered with plants, and those roots will hold that soil.
Okay, and then next there's two questions. The first is, are there any areas in the county where we can get free logs?
That's a good question. Not that I know of. That being said, there are a lot of landscape companies you can get free chip dumps, wood chip dumps. And wood chips are, of course, going to break down a lot easier or a lot quicker than logs. But a pile of wood chips would serve basically the same purpose.
And then the next question is, as the hill decreases, can you continue to rebuild with softwood, soil, and compost?
You could. The problem with that is, so in order to do that, you're taking the top off, you're taking the top out of production. So here we've got, the whole mound is in production. But if we were, say, to rebuild on top of it, then we would take this top portion out of production. And we might end up making it a little steeper. That would be my only concern with that. But eventually they all get relatively flat.
That was the last question. Does anybody else have any questions?
Like I say, there's a lot of flexibility about this, and you can experiment on a small scale. The nice thing about this, you can experiment with a small scale on this. You can make a very short bed with, like I say, wood chips. You can use woody plant material. You don't actually have to use logs. But the bigger and the longer lasting mounds are going to require logs, preferably hardwood logs. And ideally, you want a mix of hard and softwood logs, because the softwood logs are going to give out nutrients quicker, and then you still have that core base with your hardwood logs.
Okay, we have one more question that came in. Do you need to water periodically if it does not rain?
Yes. The one thing that I found is that, especially early on, when you're setting up the systems, depending on how you have it set up, this one's a good example. Ideally you put the logs down and then you put smaller bits of woody stuff down. And this creates voids. And eventually with rain, some of this is going to soak through. And so sometimes your drainage is a little off, or it drains too well, really. Not so much the drainage is off, it drains too well because of some of the big material that you have in here. So watering, especially that first year, is very important.
I don't see any more questions.
Well, thank you all for joining us today. And hopefully we will see you next time. And remember what next time is. Let's see, next time we are doing, our next class will be on the 13th of July, and it will be internet infestations, all those critters that you meet on Facebook that you shouldn't need to worry about, and a few that you do need to worry about. So that will be on the 13th, and we look forward to seeing you then.
If you enjoyed this video, please let us know your questions, comments, and suggestions for other classes and videos. For more information on water quality, stormwater, lawns, gardens, landscapes, etc., contact the Extension Horticulture Help Desk at mastergardener@pwcva.gov. Thank you, and we'll see you all the next time. If you enjoyed this video, please let us know your questions, comments, and suggestions for other classes and videos. For more information on water quality, stormwater, lawns, gardens, landscapes, etc., contact the Extension Horticulture Help Desk at mastergardener@pwcva.gov. Thank you, and we'll see you all the next time.